Educational Communications and this station present Environmental Directions with Nancy Pearlman. On this series, we explore the effects of human influence on the Earth's ecosystems and discuss solutions to environmental problems which affect the quality of life on this planet. Environmental Directions gives you the kind of information you need to help you participate in decisions impacting your community, the nation, and the world. Now, here's your host, Nancy Pearlman.
Hello. With me is Victor Bjelajac. He is the district superintendent for the North Coast Redwoods of the California State Parks. He is also a member of the Environmental Justice Quarterly Roundtable with the California Department of Parks and Recreation, Parks Operations and Tribal Relations with the California Natural Resources Agency. He is a member of the leadership group of Redwoods Rising and is also the California State Parks representative for the California Landscape Stewardship Network. In addition, he is a member of the American Anthropological Association, the Society for California Archaeology, and the Society of Professional Archaeologists. He has written numerous publications and is a speaker on many social justice forums. Welcome. It's a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you very much, Nancy.
Your responsibility for the state of California is in an area in Northern California. You're based out of Eureka for 22 state parks. These range from the Redwoods to the coast. What are they?
We have a string of parks that go from the Oregon border south to the about parallel with Leggett. And we've got inland parks, some of them on riparian environments. We've got Jed Smith on the Smith. We have Grizzly Creek on the Van Dusen. And we occupy a good bit of California coastline. Pelican State Beach, the northernmost park in the state park system, right at the corner of California. We've got Little River State Park. We have Tolowa Dunes State Park, Usal, Sinkyone, Wilderness State Park. So coastal parks manage over 50% of the existing old-growth redwoods in the world.
Your district covers 22 state parks. How many other districts are there, and how many state parks are there in California?
There are 21 other districts. Current count, I think, is 279 individual units or individual state parks.
With close to 300 state parks, you can see a wide range of places, from desert to historic buildings.
Desert parks, cultural parks, beach parks, inland parks on riparian environments. You have some parks that are reserves where we don't have much infrastructure built, but they're just natural places.
Redwoods are so famous for being beautiful old trees that grow for centuries. Do you have any way of knowing how old those living trees are?
We actually do. We have a professor up this way at Cal Poly Humboldt, recently renamed Cal Poly Humboldt, Steve Sillett, who has done corings on a number of these trees throughout the range and is able to give us estimates on age, actually just counting those rings. He's got a lab set up there, and they'll take core samples when he does some of his canopy studies. We have trees that are up to 2,500 years old, and the species for the Sequoia sempervirens on the coast are the tallest trees on Earth.
They are spectacular. All of these areas that are preserved in the parks are beautiful ecosystems. Without the park system, much of these ecosystems are being destroyed, have been destroyed. There was excessive logging of the redwoods. The coastal plains were obviously damaged due to exploitation. What are the big threats now?
Those original threats, it was a lot of timber extraction. They're less than 5% of all the redwoods that ever existed in California are now, 95% of them plus are gone. Threats that we currently have are fire. I know probably in the media, it was in the media, Big Basin fire were devastating. You had crown fires in old-growth redwoods. A lot of all of those vertical or horizontal support limbs were essentially burned off. The resiliency of redwoods are actually getting regrowth there, but it has to be wildfire. And that's one of the things we're looking at up in this geography. A lot of different agencies are looking at it, is how you can put fire on the ground or good fire on the ground to try and reduce some of those fuel loads. Another way of doing that is tens of thousands of acres we have in a park system are second growth redwoods. To try and get those on a trajectory towards old growth redwoods, we'll go in and we'll do mechanical thinning. We'll go through and pull existing logging roads and skid roads and do full recontour restoration. One of the things we try and do to reduce that fuel load is do thinning in these areas, and then that eliminate a lot of the firs that were aerial seeded by companies that were growing trees, and eliminate some of those firs, and the reiterations of the redwoods, they just start growing. And we essentially think of it as doing releases, giving them more space to grow, access to sunlight. One of the terrific things about redwoods, it is worldwide the most efficient organism for carbon sequestration.
I'm so glad that they are being preserved and protected. I know in Northern California years ago, there was an effort among conservationists to preserve the ecosystems, the forests, and the spotted owl was very famous in that battle. This is an endangered species. Has it been saved?
Still endangered and listed. We also have marbled murrelets, and that's one of those indicator species. So they require old growth for breeding and roosting, and when you lose those old-growth forests, that's a species that goes away. Think of it as a kind of a canary in a coal mine, where they would have birds down there when environments got bad. The birds perished, and we think of this when we look at these endangered or listed species, they're indicators for an entire ecosystem. They're just one part of it, but that's one way of tracking how well our forests are doing by where are we with our listed endangered species.
How many species are found in the parks? How many are endemic only in our Northern California parks? How many pass through? Because it is on the Pacific Flyway, so birds will fly quite a distance from the lower part of California to the northern part. And of course, there's so many different species other than birds, mammals, insects. Is there any kind of count, or are scientists still trying to determine what's out there?
Our natural resource program, we've got, I think on staff at this point, close to 40 folks, and they're looking at botanicals, they're looking at flora, and looking at endangered species, listed species, and what they can do to enrich those environments or assist to have these environments that are hospitable to various species. Recently, we've been doing marten studies. So Humboldt marten was one of those species that we thought we lost. There was a sighting, and that was in the 30s. There was a sighting in the 80s, and more recently, we're actually tracking populations. So we've got biologists and scientists out in the field monitoring different species. It's quite the effort to actually be out there in the woods, setting up surveys where you can do the coverage that you need and be able to characterize large swaths of land for how well, what's the forest health, what's the species health, whether it's flora or fauna.
In addition to the natural history, there's a cultural history. You are an anthropologist specializing in archaeology, but you are collaborating with the indigenous tribes. The Yurok is one such group. Who are the others? And what kind of cultural history is being preserved and protected in the parks?
I'm glad you mentioned that, Nancy. That's part of our mission. When I think of what it looks like to, steward some of these parks, it's about protection of natural resources and cultural resources, and then give people an opportunity to experience those. For cultural resources up in this area, it's rich. These lands have been occupied for thousands of years. Indigenous people still here and doing well. So in the district that I manage these lands in, we've got 14 different federally recognized tribes. We have government-to-government relationships, I believe, with 4 of them. We've entered into co-management agreements with the Yurok tribe for managing a visitor center. It's one of the few visitor centers in California where you go in and it's a totally indigenous experience. It was developed by indigenous professionals on all of the exhibits, and we do programming out of there. It's pretty cool. We've also had an emphasis on people telling their own stories in first-person narrative. So in this area, 20 years ago, you didn't have a lot of indigenous folks that were in our parks sharing their lifeways, sharing worldviews, sharing the importance of stewardship and the worldview that made the stewardship of these lands terrific. One of the points I always like to make is that when folks think of, we want to get all these lands back to that beautiful natural setting, and people go to the time of contact for that beautiful natural setting. What people are really coming into is a landscape that had been managed with fire and by people for thousands and thousands of years. It's really been the last 170 years that we've seen a lot of impacts to environment and impacts to people. California doesn't have a very good history of the way that it's treated its indigenous folks, and on the North Coast up here, we're trying to change some of that. There's been a revitalization among various tribes for the last 50 years, revitalizing, bringing back ceremonial practices, bringing back ways of doing or worldviews that are harking back to the values of the past. We support tribes in performing ceremony on these public lands. We support gathering of materials for traditional cultural practice on these lands. We do everything we can to give indigenous folks access to their ancestral homelands for whatever that may be. It may be a walk, it may be time with family, it may be practice of a cultural tradition, it may be a high ceremony. We're trying to normalize folks that have been excluded from these public lands, normalize their activity in them.
Certainly everybody needs to be concerned and involved in protecting our parks. You, as an archaeologist, have also done restoration work, and I'm sure both in the parks it's important, but you've done it for some historic buildings, including the governor's mansion in Sacramento?
Yeah, when I came into parks, I came in as a restoration work specialist, and my first 3 months on the job were at the governor's mansion in Sacramento, and that's an 1877 Victorian, and doing 3-coat smooth wall plaster work, and then getting all the windows operational. So that's what we look at for the cultural resources that we have. They can be built structures, they can be shaped, you can have cultural landscapes where people have shaped them, but you look at where humans have interacted with materials and what they build, and you're right, under California Environmental Quality Act, it's our responsibility to evaluate any structure, whether it could be a fire ring, it could be a house, it could be a bathroom, for the significance to the peoples of California. And this is kind of interesting now. We have park structures that were built to support visitation in parks that are now historic structures.
Parks belong to the public so that we can all enjoy them recreationally. We can learn from them. We can get close to nature. There is so much variety in the California parks because we have so many different kinds of ecosystems throughout the state. These are wonderful resources for humans, but also for the wildlife, which needs these protected areas that don't have a lot of trampling by human beings or buildings or roads by human beings. So there's also wilderness area in the parks. But what is the difference between the California state parks and the national parks?
Both agencies are there to protect resources and give people opportunity to experience it. Up in Northern California, we have congressionally mandated co-management of parks, Redwood, National, and State Parks. That's where we have 3 state parks, Jedediah Smith State Park, Jedediah Smith Redwood State Park, Del Norte Coast Redwood State Park, and Prairie Creek Redwood State Park. And we manage those in cooperation with National Park Service, and their park up here is Redwood National Park. What are the management techniques? They're very similar. What amenities do we offer? How do we support visitation by all people? Those are similar goals and similar methods for doing that. Trees don't care who owns the land. Animals don't care who owns the land. Streams and riparian areas don't care whose jurisdiction or who's managing it. But when we look at this cooperative land management, it's the opportunity to manage it for systems, manage it for ecosystems, manage it for species that roam and range and don't really check the ownership maps when they're going.
You mentioned that there are over 40 scientists studying the wildlife. How many interpreters are there, naturalists, archaeologists, looking at the other resources?
That's a good question. All of our programs are important. In our cultural resource program, we have 2 archaeologists and a historian and a curator. We've been expanding our interpretive staff as of late. I think we have close to 16 interpreters throughout the district. When I got to this district, we had 1.5 interpreters.
You have done so much. How do you rank your work with the parks?
It's some of the most meaningful work that I've done in my professional life.
Thank you so much for caring about these lands. Thank you so much for making them available to the public. Thank you for being my guest.
Thank you very much, Nancy. I appreciate the time.
I have been speaking with Victor Bjelajac, who is the District Superintendent of the North Coast Redwoods District with the California State Parks. I'm Nancy Pearlman. Thank you very much for joining us, and do tune in again next week.
If you would like free information about these environmental issues, go to www.ecoprojects.org or call 310-559-9160. Environmental Directions with your host, Nancy Pearlman, is a community affairs program of the nonprofit organization Educational Communications and this station.